Welcome. On behalf of the Ministry of Faith Baptist Church in Water Valley, Mississippi, thanks for viewing this video presentation. For several years, my wife Virginia and I have enjoyed watching the birds at the bird feeder in our backyard. My wife particularly enjoys watching the birds from her seat at the dining room table, which looks out into the yard through the French doors in our dining room. Several times during the year, we'll buy a 40-pound bag of bird seed to refill the feeders. During the summer, we'll have to fill the feeders a couple of times a week. We have both noticed and commented about the different nature of the various bird species. The cardinals are very caring. They usually arrive in pairs, and when there are other birds in the area, the male cardinal will watch over the female while she is on the feeder. When she is done feeding, then the male cardinal will take his turn. Some of the birds we have are forest pigeons that feed on the ground below the feeders. They, like the cardinals, arrive in pairs, sometimes 3 or more pairs at a time. What is interesting, however, is that each pair is territorial. They don't like the other pigeons to get too close. This territorial nature is especially seen in the first pair of pigeons that arrive to the feeder. They chase away the other pigeons that arrive later. That first pair keeps a diligent vigil over their position just under the feeders where most of the fallen seed rest. There are some smaller blackbirds that arrive, a dozen or more at a time, and they literally raid the bird feeders. Especially, they'll mount the feeders several at a time and just kick and spill the seed out of the feeders onto the ground below. They must have some kind of a messy plan. For the other blackbirds that can't fit around the feeders, they just eagerly wait below for the falling seeds. Every type of bird exhibits a different behavior. For example, when the aggressive blue jays arrive, the other birds leave the area. The larger blue jays can't sit on the feeder rims like the cardinals can, so they position themselves directly under the bird feeders to collect the already fallen seeds. As I've said, we enjoy watching and identifying the various bird species. The short story, Bluejay Manners, which I'm about to share with you, is written by J. Calvin Reid. Reid's short story, Bluejay Manners, is one of 30 which he wrote and incorporated into a small book titled Bird Life in Wington. In his story, Bluejay Manners, Dr. Reid illustrates the fact that some people, some birds, are just blind to the sad consequences of their bad behaviors. Well, enough said about such thoughtlessness for the moment. Now, it's time for me to share with you J. Calvin Reid's short story, Bluejay Manners. Last year, when Mr. and Mrs. Bluejay began building their nest in Oak Grove, all the birds in the neighborhood were pleased. The blue jays wore such pretty feathers and were so stylish, and they made quite a stunning presentation. The very first afternoon, Mrs. Robin flew by to leave 2 tenderloin worms for their supper. "I know you have been too busy today to think of shopping," she said to Mrs. Bluejay. Mrs. Mockingbird made a brief call also, bringing several soft pieces of string. "Just the thing," she said, "to use for lining your nest. If this is not enough, I'll bring you some more." That evening, when Mrs. Bluejay told her husband how kind her neighbors had been, he said, "You'd better watch those 2 birds. One of their husbands is probably an insurance salesman or a Fuller grass agent. If they ask to borrow our insect exterminator, the answer is no." "Well, you're probably right," said Mrs. Bluejay. "We must be careful not to get too friendly with the neighbors, at least not until we know how they rate in society. I wonder if this neighborhood is going to be good enough for us." "If not, we can move next year," said Mr. Bluejay. "It would be much easier to make the other birds move and leave Oak Grove to us and our children," she answered. "Our children?" exclaimed Mr. Bluejay. "Yes," replied Mrs. Bluejay. "Already there's 1 egg in our nest." Before long, there were 2 more eggs, and soon after that, 3 little birds. Considering what you know about their parents, you may have already guessed what kind of birds they turned out to be. Henry is the youngest of the Bluejay children. His way of trying to prove that he is not a coward is to pluck out the feathers of the birds that are smaller than he is and to call them ugly names. He also thinks it's a sign of birdliness to throw ice balls. That is, he did think so until last week when he broke Helen Flicker's glasses. Then, and was forced to pay for them out of his own allowance? "You might have put her eye out," his school principal reminded him. It seems Henry had never thought about that. One day he was riding his bicycle along the sidewalk. He bumped into some little girl birds who were walking in front of him. One of them was knocked down. Did he stop to apologize? Not Henry Bluejay. He turned and shouted, "That'll teach you to get out of the way when you see me coming," and he rode on. Penny Bluejay was as cute a bird as you'd ever seen, until she started flopping around in blue jeans. A Bluejay in blue jeans? Well, that's a joke. Well, now she's almost as coarse and as loud as her cousin Susie Crow. Their favorite pastime is to drop into the drugstore, slide under a table, order an ice cream soda, drape their feet over the edge of the booth, and hope that some boy bird will come along and be a sucker enough to pay their bill. Penny and Susie can't understand why they're not more popular with the really nice birds in Wington. In their desperation, they have used all kinds of throat gargles. It never occurs to them that their real trouble is their bad manners. Robert is the oldest of the three Bluejay children. One day he was waiting on the corner for an Oak Grove plane. Mrs. Thrush was waiting for it too, loaded down with groceries. Bob pushed right in front of her, flopped down into the only remaining seat, and buried his face in a magazine book titled Super Bird, leaving her to get along as best she could, standing in the aisle. Fortunately, Billy Flicker was on the plane too, and he proved himself to be a bird of a different feather. As soon as he saw Mrs. Thrush, he leaped to his feet and gave her his seat. Later, he helped her off the plane with her bundles. So she was so grateful that upon arriving at home, she went straight to the telephone, called Mrs. Flicker, and told her what a grand little gentleman her son was. I'm afraid Mrs. Bluejay will never get a telephone call like that. Her children are not even courteous to their own parents. They do not know what to say and how to say please or thank you. They usually answer each other by saying, "Yep, no." That is, when they're not yelling something worse, such as, "You're crazy, go jump in the lake," or "Open the door, Richard." This year, Oak Grove is a different place, because the Flickers and the Robins and the Mockingbirds and all the other birds decided to move out. "We just can't afford to allow our children to grow up loud and discourteous like the Bluejays," they said. At first, Mr. and Mrs. Bluejay were very pleased. "I'm buying their property for a song," said Mr. Bluejay to his wife. "I'm going to make a killing in real estate." But that's where he missed his guess, because there is not a bird family in Wington, not even the Crows, who are cousins of the Bluejays, who will even consider moving into the Oak Grove area, since the Bluejays have taken over. There's quite a flock of them now, between 75 and 100, and they chatter and argue and fight from morning till night to their heart's content, and I'm sorry to say, there is not a gentleman or a lady in the whole crowd. Thanks so much for watching this YouTube presentation of the reading of J. Calvin Reed's story, Bluejay Manners, just one of 30 short stories in his book, Bird Life in Wington. On behalf of the members and friends of Faith Baptist Church in Water Valley, Mississippi, I extend our prayers that God will bless your heart and home with his best in Christ Jesus.